Thanks for tuning in. You're listening to Gnostic Studies. And this evening we'd like to do a lecture on Gnostic Psychology. So, I want to wish you a Happy New Year and wish you the best in it. Health, well-being, prosperity, and of course, most important, that we can awaken our consciousness. We need to fight for it. It's not an easy thing. It takes effort in a specific direction. And that's why we're studying psychology today, because it's one of the more important aspects related with awakening of the consciousness. We have been studying this intermediate series of Gnostic Psychology. 6 weeks before, we took a 2-week break and we're back now. Last time we studied the intellect and the mind. We said that there's different types of energy: mechanical energy, vital energy, psychic energy, mental energy, willpower energy or causal energy, and then energy of the consciousness. And that no matter what type of energy we use, no matter how much the mechanical energy, the vital forces, the psychic energy, or the mental energy is increased, they can never achieve the awakening of the diverse functionings of the consciousness. And just willpower alone is not enough to do it. We have to use the energy of the consciousness. And as we mentioned in the introduction to Gnostic Psychology series, consciousness is not thinking. According to the definition that we have in this teaching, consciousness is a very particular kind of apprehension or grasping of interior knowledge that's totally independent of mental activity, which means that consciousness is beyond mental activity. It's important to understand. What else did we talk about? Because we're going to do a recap. That we need to use the sense of self-observation. In order to observe ourselves, we have to direct our attention inward. Towards our interior, to study our interior, what we are internally. The consciousness allows us to experience reality directly. Not a concept of reality, not an idea of reality, not a belief about reality, but to experience reality directly. And that's why we're studying the mind, because the mind gets in the way of us experiencing reality directly. We have lots of different thoughts in our intellectual center, in our mind. Some positive thoughts, some negative thoughts. But one of the things that we talked about is that we need to differentiate between the thought and thinking, between the thoughts that are generated by egos versus we accept the thought as ourselves thinking it. This is related to this idea of plurality of thinkers, or many minds that we have, because within us, the ego, each ego has its own mind, or uses the mind, we could even say. And so we don't really have our own thoughts. What we have, and the way that we should, the way that we should use, the way that we should use the mind is in a passive way, that is, for it to be receptive, to receive information that's sent to us by our being, by our inner divinity. But instead what happens is that our mind is active, and because it's active, it's sort of in the way, blocking, interfering with the messages that we could be receiving from our inner divinity. And who is the one that's blocking it? Who is the one that's thinking? Those egos inside of us, using the mind in order to justify obsessing over something, or identification with something, or whatever it may be. But we need to understand that just because there's a thought in our mind doesn't mean that we thought that thought, that we're the ones that originated that thought. We should be observing the mind, observing the thoughts, not accepting them, not rejecting them, just observing them in order to see where they're coming from. Because things can enter into our mind that are useful, but many times we have things that are not useful in our mind. Egos that misused the mind in order to justify imagination, fascination, fantasy, worry, justification, lots of different things. So what we want to do, and this is in Maurice Nicoll's book called Psychological Commentaries on the Teachings of Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. He talks about how we need to differentiate between the mind and thoughts. Just because we have a thought doesn't mean that it's our own thought. We need to observe those thoughts. When you observe a thought, you're not identified with it. And so this leads us to a new way of understanding thoughts and thinking. And we should learn to think in this way. That is, to not accept or reject our thoughts, but to observe them and realize that there could be egos inside of us utilizing the intellectual center. He says, if you can realize practically, that is by experience, that you can be passive to your thoughts by not identifying with them, then you have already reached a definite stage of work on the intellectual center. But if you take yourself as one, then you will never get to this point. That's why we need to understand that we're not one, but we're many. That is, until we eliminate that plurality, which is called ego, or egos, inside of us, we remain as a multitude, divided, internally divided. And of course, the goal of Gnosis is to unify ourselves. But we have to study, because we have to work on each one of these egos, each one of these divisions that exists internally. Okay, let's jump into today's class then. We're continuing to study the functioning of the mind. We talked about the difference between thinkers and thoughts, or thoughts and thinking, and that we do not have to think a thought. A thought can exist there in the mind, and you'll notice there's certainly some overlap between this and the techniques taught during meditation of Buddhism, Hinduism, many other systems. That is, that just allow the thoughts to be there, but don't identify yourself with them. They can march along like a parade, or whatever, but let them just be the thoughts. Don't associate yourself with them. Don't identify. Don't go into them. So a thought can enter our intellectual center, but we don't have to accept them as our own thoughts. We are not our thoughts. Even though there may be thoughts in our intellectual center, we do not have to take them as our own, as ourselves. So let's continue to study the intellectual center. We studied a fair amount of Maurice Nicoll in the previous class, class number 6. Now, in today's class, class number 7, we're studying a little bit of Samael and Weor in his book Revolution of the Dialectic, which is a compilation of lectures. And so he has some very interesting information about how to dominate the mind. He says we need to see the mind as something that we need to dominate. So let's look at what he says here. A great master said, "Seek enlightenment, for all else will be added onto you." Enlightenment's worst enemy is the I or ego. It is necessary to know that the I or ego is a knot, K-N-O-T, in the flow of existence, a fatal obstruction in the flow of life, free in its movement. A master was asked, "Which path is the way?" "What a magnificent mountain," the master replied, referring to the mountain where he had his haven. "I do not ask you about the mountain. Instead, I ask you about the path." The master replied, "As long as you cannot go beyond the mountain, you will not be able to find the way." Another monk asked the same question to the same master. "There it is, right before your eyes," the master answered him. "Why can I not see it?" "Because you have egotistical ideas." "Will I be able to see it, sir?" "As long as you have a dualistic vision and you say, 'I cannot,' and so on, your eyes will be blinded by that relative vision. When there is no I nor you, can it be seen? When there is no I nor you, who wants to see?" The foundation of the I, the ego, is the dualism of the mind. It is very important to understand duality. The I, the ego, is sustained by the battle of opposites. All thinking is founded on the battle of opposites. If we say so-and-so is tall, we want to say that they are not short. If we say we are entering, we want to say that we are not exiting. If we say we are happy, with that we affirm we are not sad, etc. The problems of life are nothing but mental forms with two poles, one positive and the other negative. Problems are sustained by the mind and are created by the mind. When we stop thinking about a problem, it inevitably ends. Now, let's differentiate between facts and problems. Samael mentions this as well, that we need to, like, if it's a fact that I don't have the money for rent or for food or whatever, that's not a problem. It's a fact. Now, there may be another way to go about solving it, but worrying about it, constantly thinking about it, doesn't necessarily solve the issue, doesn't necessarily change the fact. Doing something can change it. Calling somebody, asking for help, going to get a job, whatever it may be. But just thinking about it doesn't do anything. Happiness and sadness, pleasure and pain, good and evil, victory and defeat constitute the battle of the opposites upon which the I, the ego, is founded. This is related with what in Buddhism is called craving and aversion. The entire miserable life that we live goes from one opposite to another. Victory to defeat, like to dislike, pleasure to pain, failure to success, this, that, etc. We need to free ourselves from the tyranny of opposites. This is only possible by learning to live from instant to instant without any abstractions of any kind, without dreams, without fantasies. Have you observed how the stones of the road are pale and pure after a torrential rain? One can only murmur an "oh" of admiration. One should comprehend that "oh" of things without deforming that divine exclamation with the battle of the opposites. Here he's got another Eastern quote of a story. Joshu asked the master Nansen, "What is the Tao?" "Ordinary life," replied Nansen. "What does one do to live in accordance with it?" "If you try to live in accordance with it, it will flee away from you. Do not try to sing that song. Let it sing itself. Does not the humble hiccup come by itself?" And then Samael says, "Remember this phrase. Gnosis lives in deeds, withers away in abstractions, and is difficult to find even in the noblest of thoughts." And he's got another story. They asked the master Bokujo, do we have to dress and eat daily? How could we escape from this?" The master replied, "We eat, we get dressed." "I do not comprehend," said the disciple. "Then get dressed and eat," said the master. This is precisely action free of the opposites. Do we eat? Do we get dressed? Why make a problem of that? Why think of other things while we are eating and getting dressed? If you are eating, eat. If you are getting dressed, get dressed. And if you are walking on the street, then walk. But do not think of something else. Do only what you are doing. Do not run away from the facts. Do not fill them with so many meanings and symbols and sermons and warnings. Live them without allegories. Live them with a receptive mind, from instant to instant. Comprehend that we are talking to you about the path of action, free from the painful battle of opposites. Action without distractions, without evasions, without fantasies, without abstractions of any kind. Change your character, beloved. Change it through intelligent action, free from the battle of the opposites. When the doors are closed to fantasy, then the organ of intuition is awakened. Action free from the battle of the opposites is intuitive action, full action. And where there is plenitude, the I, the ego, is absent. Intuitive action leads us by the hand to the awakening of the consciousness. Let us work and rest happily abandoning ourselves to the course of life. Let us exhaust the turbid and rotten water. Let us exhaust the turbid and rotten water of habitual thinking, and in the emptiness will flow gnosis, and with it, the happiness of living. This intelligent action, free from the battle of the opposites, elevates us to a point in which something must break. When everything works well, then the rigid roof of thinking breaks, and the light and power of the inner self enters like a flood into the mind which has stopped dreaming. Then, in the physical world and outside of it, during the sleep of the material body, we live totally conscious and enlightened, enjoying the joy of life in the superior worlds. This continuous tension of the mind, this discipline, takes us to the awakening of the consciousness. If we're eating and thinking about business, then it is clear that we are dreaming. If we are driving an automobile and we're thinking of our fiancé, it is logical that we are not awake, we are dreaming. If we are working and we are remembering our child's godfather or godmother, or our friend or our brother or sister, etc., it is clear that we are dreaming. People who live dreaming in the physical world also live dreaming in the internal worlds during the hours in which the physical body is asleep. One needs to cease dreaming in the internal worlds. When we stop dreaming in the physical world, we awaken here and now, and that awakening appears in the internal worlds. First seek enlightenment, and all else shall be added unto you. Whosoever is enlightened sees the way. Whosoever is not enlightened cannot see the way, and can easily be led astray from the path and fall into the abyss. Terrible is the effort and the vigilance needed from second to second, from instant to instant, in order to not fall into illusions. A minute of unawareness is enough, and the mind is already dreaming, upon recalling something, upon thinking of something different from the job or deed that we are living at the moment. When in the physical world we learn to be awake from instant to instant, then we shall live awake and self-conscious from instant to instant in the internal worlds during the hours of sleep of the physical body, and also after death. It is painful to know that the consciousness of all human beings sleeps and dreams profoundly, not only during those hours of rest of the physical body, but also during that state ironically called the vigil state. Action free from mental dualism produces the awakening of the consciousness. It is clear that we need to become independent from the mind. Right now, the mind is certainly a prison where we are all prisoners. We need to break out of that prison if we really want to know what liberty is, that liberty which does not belong to time, that liberty which is not of the mind. First, we should remember that the mind is something that is not of the being. We need to learn how to dominate the mind, not others' minds, but our own, if we want to become independent of it. To do so, it is indispensable to learn to see the mind as something that we should dominate, as something that we should tame. Let us remember the Divine Master Jesus entering Jerusalem on his donkey on Palm Sunday. That donkey is the mind, which we need to subdue. We should ride the donkey and not have the donkey ride us. Unfortunately, people are victims of the mind, since they do not know how to ride it. When it is said that we should dominate the mind, The one who has to dominate the mind is the essence, the consciousness. By awakening consciousness, we have more power over the mind, and thereby we become conscious of what is unconscious in us. It is urgent and undelayable to dominate the mind, converse with it, recriminate it, strike it with the whip of willpower, and make it obey. So we're going to talk about this now, these techniques that he gives. Before all else, we should not become identified with the mind. Because if we feel ourselves being the mind, if we say, I am reasoning, I am thinking, then we are affirming an absurdity. Because the being does not need to think. The being is the life which throbs in each atom, just as it throbs in each sun. What thinks is not the being. We do not have the entire being incarnated, but we have incarnated a part of the being, which is the essence, or Buddhata. That part of soul which exists in us, the spiritual, the psychic material, the psychic essence, it's also sometimes called. It is necessary for this living essence to impose itself upon the mind. We need to subdue the mind and interrogate it. However, we do not need to subdue other people's minds, because that is black magic. What we need is to subdue our own mind and dominate it. We must get beyond the mind in order to experience what is truly real. And this is possible through meditation, prayer, and by practicing all the methods given in the Gnostic teachings. In order to get out of the prison of the mind, the essence needs to dominate the mind. We can use the following methods to achieve this. Understanding the mechanism of the mind, using the key of synthesis, that is, the synthesis of the opposites, thesis and antithesis, observing what is inattentive within ourselves, analyzing or dissecting doubts, and commanding the mind, that is, calling the mind to order with the whip of willpower. So, we've already studied it a little bit, but the mechanism of the mind is related with that duality, and therefore comparing. The mind is dualistic and sees everything through the battle of the opposites, which implies that the mind works through comparing. It is always comparing one thing with another, and therefore it does not let things be as they are. Instead, it always wants to understand one thing through its subjective associations with another thing or things. So if I say, my country is the best, what am I doing? I'm comparing the country to other countries. If I say, my car is the best, or my job is the best, or my job is the worst, or my car is the worst, it's related with comparing it to something else. So understand that the mind always wants to compare. My second Gnostic instructor used to say, the mind always compares. So if you catch yourself comparing, then you can realize in those moments that that's two egos, or an ego trying to work with a memory or with something else to deviate you from self-awareness. So the mechanism of the mind is duality, using duality, and of comparing in order to create opposites. Next step, using the key of synthesis. Since the mind uses the mechanism of comparing, we can counteract this by analyzing the spectrum of its comparison. when we look at the minds comparing, we see that in order for the mind to know, in quotation marks, which is certainly not a real knowing or Gnostic knowing, but rather is an assuming, it's assumptions that the mind makes. What the mind really does is picks a certain point within the full spectrum of the opposites that it has that it has used to compare. In order to counteract this, we simply analyze the spectrum in order to determine the big picture. We may begin by looking at the opposite of the conclusion that the mind is telling us or wants us to have. And then we ask ourselves why. So the key of synthesis is through asking ourselves why. Why do I think my country is the best country? Why do I think my job is the best job or my job is the best or the worst job? Why is one opposite better than the other? What makes it so? What is in between those opposites? What is in between the good and bad in my mind? And what is outside of that? These types of questions allow us to see the so-called thesis and antithesis. It's also been called affirmation and negation of a particular spectrum of things that we're trying to comprehend. And doing so, analyzing this spectrum, is called the discussion. A thorough look at the spectrum gives us a full discussion of the subject matter, within which we can find the solution or synthesis of what the mind was presenting to us in a skewed way. This is called affirmation, negation, discussion, solution. So affirmation is like one side, negation is the other side. Discussion is looking at what's between those two sides, the spectrum. And then solution or synthesis is an understanding or the wisdom that we extract from not just allowing the mind to present or for us to accept what it's presenting to us, but understanding all of it, and how the mind is trying to deceive us. And part of what we can do is ask in prayer for assistance with this, because this is what allows us to comprehend a particular subject matter. Ego and why it's so strong, why we keep thinking about something. So we can pray and ask our inner divinity to help us with that. So now we'll see how Samael explains this. He says, the dominion of the mind goes beyond the struggle of what we do when a thought of hate. What do we do when a thought of hatred and evil memory assaults us? Well, then we have to try to comprehend it, to try to see its antithesis, which is love. If there is love, why is there hatred? What for? When there surges forth, for example, the memory of a lustful act, then one has to pass through the mind the sacred chalice and the sacred lance. One has to say, why do I have to profane the sacred with morbid thoughts? If the memory of a tall person surges forth, one should see them as short. This would be correct, since the key is in the synthesis. Knowing how to always find the synthesis is beneficial, because from the thesis one has to pass to the antithesis. However, the truth is not found in the antithesis, nor in the thesis. In the thesis and in the antithesis there is discussion, and that is what is really wanted. Affirmation, negation, discussion, solution. Affirmation of a bad thought. Negation of the same through comprehension of the opposite. Discussion. One has to discuss what is real from one and the other until one arrives at wisdom. And then the mind becomes quiet and in silence. And that is the solution. This is how one should practice. All of this is part of the conscious practices of the observation of what is inattentive within ourselves. But if we simply say it is the memory of a tall person and we put a short person in front of it, period, then this is not correct. What is correct would be saying tall and short, so what? They are nothing but two aspects of the same thing. What matters is not what is tall or short, but what there is of truth behind all of this. Tall and short are two illusory phenomena of the mind. In this way, one arrives at the synthesis and at the solution. We need to study the disorder of the mind, because it is only in this manner that we can establish order. We need to know what in us is attentive and what in us is inattentive. Always, when entering meditation, our mind is divided into two parts. The part which pays attention, the attentive part, and the inattentive part. It is not the attentive part that we need to focus on, but rather it is precisely on what is inattentive in us. When we're able to comprehend in depth what is inattentive in us and study the procedures so that the inattentive becomes attentive, then we will have achieved the stillness and silence of the mind. So what he's talking about is when we're trying to sit down and meditate and something we keep thinking about a song or a person or an event or food or whatever it is. And these thoughts just keep over and over again sort of dwelling. And so what we can do, first of all, we need to not identify with the thoughts. We've already discussed that. But next, what we can do is observe and look into it in order to figure out why we keep thinking about it. Let me continue here. But we have to be wise in meditation, judging ourselves and knowing what is inattentive in us. We need to make ourselves conscious of what exists in us that is inattentive. When we observe what is inattentive in us, we also see the struggle of the opposites in the mind. This is when we have to tear those opposites or antitheses apart to see what they have that is true within them. One should also dissect memories, emotions, desires, and preoccupations which are ignored, or those which we do not know where they come from or why they emerge. The next step, or phase of understanding this, is making the inattentive attentive, or converting subconsciousness into consciousness. The inattentive is what is formed by the subconscious, by the incoherent, by the amount of memories that surge forth in the mind, by the memories of the past that assault us over and over, by the debris of the memory, etc. So we talked about memory in, I think it was the 5th or the 6th class in the introductory series. Memory is a very interesting thing because there's the memory, but then we have associations. We associate it with something. And so a lot of times memories come up during meditation. It's important for us to meditate, to continue to meditate when that memory comes up and not allow it to distract us, so that, but not throw it away either, so that we can comprehend what happened. Because a lot of times we have memories and we associate something with it that shouldn't be, that the ego has associated with it. And we need to rearrange that in the mind. We have a lot of memories that we associate with things. Oh, that person wronged me, or I missed this opportunity, or whatever it may be. And we need to see what really happened and go back over that and go into it in order to extract the wisdom from it. So if you want to study more about memories, it's related with impressions, and it's, I think it might actually be class 6 in the introductory series. But it's impressions, the one that talks about impressions. But jumping back into what we're reading here, the elements which constitute the subconscious should be neither accepted nor rejected. But one has to simply make oneself conscious of what there is of inattentive in us. And in this manner, what is inattentive becomes attentive in a natural and spontaneous manner. This is what we want, for the inattentive to become attentive. One has to make a continuous meditation of daily life. Meditation is not only that action of quieting the mind when we are at home or in the sanctuary, but it also encompasses the thread of daily living, so that life immediately becomes a constant meditation. Then he says something very interesting. The mind in itself is the ego. Ignorance is what there is in the mind. Why? Because we only see part of a thing with the mind. We do not see it as it is in and of itself. We only see our subjective concept or perspective of it. Real wisdom is not in the mind. It is beyond the mind. The mind is ignorant. Because of this, it falls into many serious errors. The mind has not made anyone happy. True happiness is far beyond the mind. Dreams belong to the unconscious. When one awakens consciousness, one leaves dreams behind. Dreams are nothing but projections of the mind. What is important in us is to awaken consciousness, to stop dreaming, to stop thinking. This thinking, which is cosmic matter, is the mind. What we need is to become independent, to come out of the dungeon of matter, because the mind is matter. We have to come out of matter, to live as beings, as happy creatures, beyond matter. Matter does not make anyone happy. Matter is always gross, although it assumes beautiful forms. If what we seek is happiness, then matter will always be painful. If we're looking for authentic happiness, we will not find it in matter, but in spirit. What we need is to know how to free ourselves from the mind. This is the objective of our exercises and our studies. As we have said, in us exists, for example, 3% of consciousness and 97% subconsciousness. So what we have of consciousness should direct itself to what we have of unconsciousness or subconsciousness in order to recriminate it and make it see that it has to become consciousness. This matter of the conscious part directing itself to the subconscious part is a very important exercise that can be practiced at dawn, so that in this manner the unconscious parts become conscious little by little. The exercise given is to meditate at dawn with the consciousness focused on what is inattentive, so that it can become conscious of what is inattentive, and we can become conscious of what is inattentive in us. And I refer you to chapter 3 of the Revolution of Dialectic if you want to know more. Another thing that happens, what we'll notice when we're meditating, is that also doubts appear. In the same way that we need to look at those memories and the associations we have with memories, we also need to look at these doubts. He says to become independent of the mind is important, so as to know what is real. Not to know it intellectually, but to really and truly experience it. While paying attention to what is inattentive in us, we can see different forms of skepticism, of disbelief, of doubt, etc. If a doubt crosses the mind, we should dissect the doubt. When a doubt has been properly studied, when it has been dissected, it does not leave any trace whatsoever in the memory. It disappears. But when a doubt persists, when we want to incessantly combat it, then a conflict is formed. Every doubt is an obstacle or impediment for meditation. But it is not by rejecting doubts that we're going to eliminate them. Rather, it is by dissecting them to see what they hide, what is real within them. So, we need to analyze the doubt, tear it to pieces, and reduce it to dust, not by fighting it, but by opening it up with the scalpel of self-criticism, by carrying out a rigorous dissection of it. It is only in this manner that we will come to discover what is important in the doubt, what was real and what was unreal in it. Therefore, doubts sometimes serve to clarify concepts. When one eliminates a doubt through rigorous analysis, when one dissects it, one discovers a truth. And from that truth, something more profound comes. More knowledge, more wisdom. Wisdom comes from direct experience, from our own experimenting, and through profound meditation. The next thing is that we're going to talk to the mind in order to make it fall into order, and that order is that the essence should be the one in control. The consciousness should be the one that dominates the mind. And so the consciousness is going to talk to the mind, to give it commands. There are times that we need to talk with the mind, because many times when we want the mind to be still, when we want the mind to be in silence, it persists in its stubbornness, in its useless chattering, in the struggle of the opposites. Therefore, it is necessary to interrogate the mind and to say to it, "Well, mind, what is it that you want? Answer me." Very interesting to do this in meditation, because then something will come up, like a memory or a question, or it's trying to grasp something. If the meditation is profound, then a representation can emerge within us. In that representation, in that figure, in that image, is the answer. We should then converse with the mind and make it see the reality of things, until we make it realize that its answer is wrong. We must make it realize that its preoccupations are useless, and the reason why these preoccupations are useless. And in the end, the mind remains still, in silence. But if we notice that illumination does not emerge, that the chaotic state, the incoherent confusion, with its struggle and incessant chattering, still persists within us, then we have to call the mind to order once again, interrogating it, saying, "What is it you want? What are you looking for? Why do you not leave me in peace?" One needs to speak clearly and converse with the mind as if it was a strange individual, because certainly it is a stranger, since it is not of the being. We need to treat it like a strange subject. We may even need to recriminate it and scold it. When we wisely see that there is a need to call the attention of the mind, then there is a critical point where one has gotten tired of the mind that does not want to obey. Then there is no choice but to recriminate it, to speak to it forcefully, to deal with it face to face as with a strange and unfavorable subject. One has to lash it with the whip of willpower, recriminate it with harsh words until one makes it obey. one has to converse many times with the mind so that it will understand. If it does not understand, then one has to strongly call it to order. To not identify with the mind is critical. One has to whip the mind, subjugating it, dominating it. In this manner we come out of the mind and arrive at the truth, that which is certainly not of time, beyond time. So now we're getting to the end here. We mentioned talking to the mind. This is the conclusion where we're going to talk about something called probationism and using the will. Probationism is the science that studies the mental essences which imprison the soul. It is the science of esoteric ordeals. Ordeals are tests that we pass through in the physical world or sometimes in the astral world in order to see where we are in ourselves. Probationism is that internal wisdom which permits us to study the prisons of the mind. It is the pure science which permits us to know the errors of individual minds in depth. The human mind should liberate itself from fear and cravings. It should liberate itself from the desire of accumulation, from attachments, hatred, egotism, violence, etc. The human mind should liberate itself from the reasoning processes that divide the mind into the battle of the opposites, or the battle of the antitheses. A mind divided by the depressing process of options cannot serve as an instrument to the intimus or inner being. We have to learn to exchange the reasoning process for the beauty of comprehension. Another way of saying comprehension is understanding. The process of conceptual election divides the mind and gives birth to lost action and to useless effort. Desire and cravings are obstacles for the mind. Those shackles lead the human being to all types of errors, the result of which is karma. Fear causes the mind to have the desire for security. The desire for security enslaves the willpower, converting it into a prisoner of definitive self-imposed barriers within which hide all human miseries. Fear brings all types of inferiority complexes. The fear of death causes human beings to arm themselves and to assassinate one another. The man who carries a revolver at his waist is a fearful man. The brave man does not carry weapons because he does not fear anyone. The fear of life, of death, of hunger, of misery, of coldness and nakedness engender all types of inferiority complexes. Fear leads people to violence, hatred, exploitation, etc. The minds of people live going from one prison to another. Each prison is a school, a religion, a mistaken concept, a prejudice, a desire, an opinion, a belief, etc. The human mind should learn to flow seriously in an integral way without the painful process of reasoning, which divides it with the battle of the opposites. The mind should become like a child in order for it to be able to serve as an instrument to the intimus or inner being. We should always live in the present because life is only an eternal instant. We should liberate ourselves from all types of preconceptions and desires. We should move only under the impulses of the being. Covetousness, anger, lust have their den in the mind and lead souls to the abyss. The human being is not the mind. The mind is merely one of the four bodies of sin. When the human being becomes identified with the mind, then it goes into the abyss. The mind is merely a donkey upon which we should ride in order to enter the celestial Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. When the mind besieges us with useless representations, let us talk to it in this manner. Mind, remove these representations. I do not accept them from you. You are my slave, and I am your Lord. When the mind besieges us with representations of hatred, fear, anger, cravings, covetousness, lust, etc., then let us talk to the mind in this manner. Mind, remove these things from me. I do not accept them from you. I am your master, I am your Lord, and you should obey me because you are my slave until the end of time. Now we need human beings of willpower who do not let themselves be enslaved by the mind. So that's the material we wanted to present to you guys today. Now we're going to open it up for questions and comments. If you have any, please submit them in the comment area. It's very interesting, the ideas that are given related with the mind and how to handle it. And we invite you to reflect on this more in your practice during your meditation, especially applying these techniques. And so we have them there in the let's see, sort of in the middle. Where did I put it? Sort of in the middle, but it's also on the handout. And in order to go to the handout, which is linked in the description, but it's on this page, this one right here. So we will also want to invite you to meditation tomorrow night. We'll be doing meditation at the same time. If you're interested, please join us. We'll go through some singles transmutation exercises and some mantra work, some vocalization in order to help quiet the mind, so that we can have that quiet, still mind that allows us to receive the information from our inner divinity. Doesn't look like there's any questions or comments at this time. So if you have any, please feel free to leave them in the comment area, and we'll get to them next time we're back online. But we want to wish you guys a happy Epiphany. Today is the 6th of January, 2022, which is also called the Three Kings Day. Supposedly, or according to tradition, we could say this is the day that the three magi came to bring gifts for the Christ child. So I wonder if this isn't the origination of gift giving during this time of year, was this Epiphany, Three Kings Day. In any case, happy Epiphany, happy 2022, and thank you guys for your time. Thank you for your attention, and we will talk to you soon. And we look forward to another meditation tomorrow, and we hope that you can join us for that.